Good evening. How are you doing, Louise? And how are you doing, Emma?
Hi, very well, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Great.
thank
Look,
you.
I'm just going to take you through this, and I hope that you'll be able to enlighten us all about what's been going on. Lots of people don't know. How and when did you come to find out that Bristol City Council was intending to put a motion in front of its members which proposed to support trans rights in the way that would subvert women's rights to privacy, dignity, and fairness? Louise,
Well,
do you
before we get on to that, when Emma and I were having a chat, I have come across quite a few people who don't understand local government. So I thought if I did a little explainer about Bristol and the type of council it is, that might be useful. I was actually going to do a little bit more, but I hadn't realised how many regional variations there are. So I wanted to explain that Bristol City Council is a unitary authority, and it's unusual in the UK in that its executive function is controlled by its directly elected mayor, but not for long. More on that later. Bristol's got 34 or 35 wards, depending which web page you read, and there are 70 councillors and 4 Labour MPs. So in terms of the mayor, it's an executive position, and there's a lot of authority resting there. However, there has been a vote to return to committee-based decision-making. So the current mayor, Marvin Rees, will be gone in spring 2024. And what's interesting about this motion in particular is that the mayor, the chap that holds a lot of the power, was on holiday when the Labour Party and the Greens brought this forward. So there's also a Lord Mayor, which is more of a ceremonial role, and the Lord Mayor conducts the meetings. There are 25 Greens, 24 Labour, and 14 Conservatives. So 8 Liberal Democrat councillors were elected, but 2 defected to an independent party, Knoll Community, and 1 lost a recent by-election to the Greens. But the decision-making, again, back to the mayor, and I do think this is quite unusual in local government, all 8 cabinet members are Labour Party councillors because the mayor gets to appoint them. There is a little bit more, but I'm going to stop there and let Emma tell you a little bit more.
I'm not sure I can tell you more about the structure. Louise is much more expert on me than me. And just to say, Alison, I really haven't got a long history of activism at all. My activism began really with GC politics when I headed down the rabbit hole on this issue, and I've had to learn quickly along the way. And I'm very grateful for working alongside people like Louise and the rest of the members of our group. Really, even though it's just Louise and I speaking today, it really there's many people being involved in this, and I've really just played a minor part in it. So when we talk about we did this, it really is a whole collective effort. So in terms of how it all started, Lou will be able to give more details about it, but she'd founded a gender critical network, and on the 1st of July last year, one member of that, who's got a connection to one of the political parties in Bristol, had spotted this draft motion, had been added to the agenda and posted it in that gender critical group. And that was just 4 days before the motion was to be discussed. And then Lou acted really quickly, and we all got together. There was lots of networking among various different GC networks in Bristol, and she organised some signatures to a letter. Do you want to just talk about that letter, Lou?
Yeah, sure. Lovely. Thank you, Emma. So I emailed the Bristol Council, the officer, and the leader of each political party, the mayor and the Lord Mayor, as well as the local independents and 4 journalists, a comprehensive document which had a rebuttal of each and every statement made. If you look at the policy, you will see that some very egregious, we do use that word more than once, egregious statements are made, and they are, in inverted commas, backed up by polls, which Emma will tell you a little bit more about later. And we don't believe that that was comprehensive evidence. So part of the document was a rebuttal of every statement. And it was a collective effort by Women's Voices Matter. And there were a couple of women that put in a huge, huge amount of work, for which we're all very grateful. In my email, I requested a meeting to discuss our concerns, but I only received one response. It was a generic response from Democratic Services, because I wanted the document that we'd produced to go to full council. I received an acknowledgement from the Bristol West Labour MP, Thangam Debonair, but it felt like it had sunk like a stone. So in terms of how local councillors responded, do you want to do that one, Emma?
Well, shall I just talk a little bit about what was in the actual motion that we found so objectionable in the first place? Well, it began with a very long preamble full of contested statistics about discrimination faced by trans people, and they were very much those statistics we've all seen on Twitter and elsewhere, based on Stonewall organised, self-reported, very small sample surveys, and we didn't think that they were very reliable and not a very good context for people discussing this issue. The motion asked the council to recognise and affirm trans men are men, trans women are women, non-binary and genderqueer people's genders are valid, and that trans rights are human rights. So obviously there's very little to object to with the idea that trans rights are human rights. I think everybody in our group would support that notion, but the rest of it we found quite problematic. I'm going to read some of this, so apologies. I just want to get the wording right on this. The motion made a series of resolutions, and some of these were actually toned down in the 5 days, we think, before they actually went to council and was voted on. But to give you a flavour of how extreme some of the original proposal was, one of the recommendations was that the council vote for menstrual care dispensers and sanitary bins to be in all toilets regardless of gender in Bristol. So our reading of that was that it was to be in all toilets that the public accessed in Bristol. It wasn't clear whether these were in, for example, pubs or what kind of facilities they were in. This was later revised to say that there needed to be sanitary bins in all toilets regardless of gender in toilets in the council's property estate. A second egregious point was that the original motion said that, and I quote, the council recognises that beliefs such as that of gender critical can be protected. However, this does not provide the right to express those beliefs. So you can see why we objected to that idea. But the final version that went before the council still included a number of controversial resolutions. I think the actual motion itself has gone into the chat, or will do, so you can read it yourself later, including the marked up version. So one of the controversial parts of that motion said that the council should resolve not to take advice from or award contracts to organisations that promote an anti-trans agenda or propaganda, which obviously wasn't defined. This was later amended to add that this does not preclude the council using, where appropriate, third-party providers that utilise appropriate exemptions under equalities law to provide single-sex services as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. But it still included that notion that the council would not be allowed to do business with anybody who was guilty of wrongthink on this issue, and provided no guidance as to how that wrong thinking about anti-transgender or propaganda would be defined. The motion also said that the council would resolve to encourage schools to follow expert legal advice outlined by the Good Law Project, that it will consider publishing a trans inclusion toolkit for our schools as available in Brighton, and that it will act on any known instances of anti-trans literature or propaganda being sent into our schools. And again, it didn't say what kind of action it would take when a school received some anti-trans literature, or obviously what constituted anti-trans literature, but we suspected it would include, for example, the toolkit published by Transgender Trend.
Yes. Yeah.
We thought it would have the toolkit that all sorts are used in Brighton.
Which,
I think that's what they mentioned Brighton, and that was what we presumed that they were talking about, which is itself been quite a controversial piece of work.
And you say anti-trans was never defined as to what they meant by that?
No, anti-trans agenda or propaganda. So we felt that this had a really deep chilling effect because there was so little definition of what any of these terms meant. It would, well, just clearly a chilling effect on businesses and elements within the motion as well that we thought would having a chilling effect on how council officers themselves behaved as employees.
Yeah.
And on teachers, of course, when it talked about using guidance outlined by the Good Law Project.
Oh yes, the experts on tax
The
law.
famous Good Law Project experts, yes.
Yeah. So tell me, then what happened? You didn't have a response from many of the elected representatives, but you did have from Thangan Debonair. I've noticed she's usually very responsive.
Just an acknowledgement from Thangan.
I see.
So it was pretty short notice because July the 5th was the day of the full council meeting, and Emma and I both wanted to be there, but we both have children that have a birthday on the 5th of July.
Oh.
Fortunately, other gender critical people in Bristol did attend. They made representation. They read out their statements. And the meeting was broadcast on YouTube. The link is still available. I don't know about Emma, but I found myself leaving the birthday dinner table to go and take quick looks on YouTube to see what the vote was. Needless to say, the motion was passed by a huge majority. So then we needed to spring into action.
Yeah, just to say, I think many of the members of our group had emailed or contacted their own councillors. My councillors are two Green councillors, and both of them acknowledged that this was a controversial issue within the Green Party. Obviously, it's got a little bit more controversial even since then. And one of them, I think, may be a lesbian, and she said she shared some of my concerns about what was in there. But obviously not so much that stopped them both voting for it. They both voted for the motion.
So then what happened? Once they passed the motion?
Oh, the next thing that happened was that we formed an alliance. We formed a group. So through gender critical networking, we formed a group. But another thing that happened is that because people had put statements into the council papers, people that watch council documents spotted who we were, spotted some of our names, and one of the members of our group came forward. He's here tonight in the Zoom, and he had been a legal officer, the former monitoring officer at Bristol City Council for 12 years. So we were fortunate to have his expertise. So we had our very first Zoom meeting, those of us that had come together to make representation opposing the motion. And something that I will note from the group is that everybody joined the Zoom and was very enthusiastic and really wanted to get going and suggested actions. Let's do this, let's do that. And I was the damp squib, and I insisted on collectively identifying an outcome. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, I wonder if I'm the only person that remembers. And it felt for me that the outcome was to give Bristol City Council a way to backtrack, a path, a way that they can use to get back from where they were when they say trans women are women, trans men are men, and begin to recognise sex-based rights and to revoke their ideology. And then because we had that outcome, all our subsequent strategic planning and tactics can then align with the outcome. As a group, a few members would attend all full council meetings and ask questions of the mayor, which he batted off to the council, and made statements which the council don't need to answer in the meeting during full council. we also sent lots of emails. There was corporate complaint, there were freedom of information requests. 2 people wrote to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. One met with her local MP, and we continued sending FOIs and emails out. But over time, as we attended these full council meetings, we noted something really interesting happening. And that was that people would leave the council chamber. Elected members, councillors, there to represent their constituents, would stand up, turn around and walk away from us. And once or twice, if they'd chosen not to leave, they would turn their backs and look at their computers and type. The next step happened in August 2022. So there was a short consultation, that's the word they use. We felt as a group that it was pretty woeful, and it was accompanied by an equalities impact assessment, and we hadn't seen any evidence of an equalities impact assessment prior to this. We certainly didn't see one relating to the motion. It was severely flawed. For example, the template asked what impact the policy might have on groups with protected characteristics. Actually, when I say the word policy, I realise I've not been clear. So the motion led to a policy. They initially proposed 2 policies, but I think I might have jumped the gun, so I'm going to hand back to Emma for a minute.
No, I don't know if you have. I think that there was so much going on that it's difficult to put it in a chronological order. So Louise is right. We continue to try and be a bit of a thorn in the council side and just keep turning up and asking awkward questions and sending awkward emails, which quite often went unanswered, and battled away with FOIs and trying to seek responses to those. A group of us also leafleted outside a Women's Day event organised by Bristol Women's Voice. Is that I'm sorry if I got the name wrong, but it's the city's women's quasi-formal women's forum, and I believe, but may be wrong, that it receives money from the council from some of its operations. I think Alison is sorry, one of our members is nodding, so I think that's right. They held a big day with lots of talks and things going on, and we stood outside of the council chambers when that was happening and handed out leaflets, and they got terribly flustered about that and came outside and asked us to move along, and we very politely said no, we won't, we'll carry on leafleting out here. But just to give you an idea of the way that it's very difficult to get groups on board, even though they are there specifically to represent different groups with protected characteristics, because they are often given funding to do that representation by the council, which clearly presents them with a dilemma. So we struggled to get Bristol Women's Voice to engage with us at all or note any of the potential problems with what the council had passed in their motion. So sometimes we really felt like we were being fobbed off by the council and by some of the groups that represented people that would be impacted by the motion as well. But we did have one clear success. As Lou has mentioned, we've been very lucky to have a former legal officer involved with the council who looked around at what was going on at other councils in the country and saw that South Oxfordshire Council had a similar motion. And it turned out that although they'd passed a motion that said trans women are women, trans men and men are so on, but they subsequently appointed a new legal officer at that council who presumably came in, saw this motion and went, goodness me, that seems to go far beyond what the council should be doing. And he sought a legal opinion from a barrister, and I believe that the barrister he sought that opinion from had represented Index for Censorship, who was one of the interveners in the Maya Forstater case, and her opinion was clearly that the council had gone too far. And off the back of that advice, he made a statement at South Oxfordshire Full Council saying that while he acknowledged that the motion had been very that the council had the right to say such things, but it had just been a statement of political aspiration, but was legally non-binding. Now that really helped us, because then it gave us something that we could take to Bristol City Council and say, look, another council passed a similar motion, but they've had legal advice from a very senior KC to say that this is legally non-binding. Is the motion that you've passed, is that also legally non-binding? Because we thought that would be really persuasive in the way that we could try to minimise the chilling effect that motion had had. We could seek to publicise, if we were able to persuade any of the local press to help publicise, which was a challenge in itself to do that. So I think a number of our members made statements at the submitted statements to the council and asked questions at full council meetings, and eventually the Lord Mayor, who is I don't think it's relevant to her position as Lord Mayor, but was a former Green councillor. She emailed and confirmed that the motion had no legal basis, but she didn't say this publicly. There was never anything published on Bristol City Council's website or stated in the council meeting, which meant that it was very difficult for us as a small group to get that information out. But we felt that was a success, because she had actually conceded that no, it had no legal basis on its own. So because it was just a political aspiration, what the council then needed to do was to follow its own policy making processes and develop a policy that would implement that motion, which is then what they went ahead and did. So Louise can talk a little bit more about the consultation that they held on that draft policy.
So the Silver motion was passed in July, 5th of July, 2022. The consultation came out in August 2022. It was a short consultation, but it was accompanied by this equalities impact assessment. And although there was a reference to impact that the policy might have on groups with protected characteristics, such as disability or pregnancy, the answers weren't actually there. Council officials chose to answer by considering the impact it would have on disabled trans people or pregnant trans people. So it was quite interesting, because there were web links to two gender critical groups, Women's Place UK and Transgender Trend, and they were in the equality impact assessment. But when you clicked on the web links, they didn't actually work. So once the council had published the consultation, we felt it was really important to get the word out to as many people as possible. I did a video for Women's Declaration International. We networked in our groups. We contacted our friends, and 2 of us drafted and sent a press release to 30 journalists. Not one single journalist picked it up. It really felt like we were hitting a brick wall. We thought that the faith groups, women's groups would come forward, would want to respond, but it was as if they really wanted to pretend it wasn't happening. And it seemed depressing and hopeless at the time. But when the final policy was published, the documents issued alongside it made reference to this issue being controversial. So we felt at some point that our representations were making a difference. There was talk about maintaining sex-based protections. We don't see that that's happened, but at least it was mentioned. Most of our points and concerns have been noted, even if they were ignored. We still got them on the record. So we do believe that we put the council on alert and possibly on the back foot, and we don't know how many more policies they might have tried to introduce off the back of the motion if it wasn't for us continuing to challenge them.
And have they introduced any new policies which would actually impact other protected characteristics?
They did. They followed on. At the time of the consultation being published, it was on the website with 2 draft policies, one for the city and one for employees. So one for the public, essentially, and one for employees, and the equality impact assessment. When they finally came through, only the one for the employees was then drafted and put into motion. I've Googled for different policies at different councils, and I would say that I have come across approximately 30. I've got a list of policies that do state trans women are women, or similar statements at councils across the country. That's not unusual. I think what is slightly unusual is the motion itself, the silver motion. And Manchester City Council have a motion. Norwich have put one through. We wrote a piece for Sex Matters, and I'll pop the link in the chat. If you read the Sex Matters link, it goes through, there's a list of the other councils that we found so far, not all the ones with work policies, and it takes you to the motion and to the document that we drafted.
Right. So what it sounds as though by drawing people's attention to this, that your group has kind of stymied them a little bit because they know that they're under the spotlight now.
I hope so. I mean, we don't know that. It's a counterfactual, isn't it? But, you know, in all the midst of feeling rather demoralized by what has happened, I think that we can take some comfort from the idea that they might have tried to implement they might have introduced policies that tried to implement part of the motion, for example, tackling schools that received so-called anti-trans propaganda, or trying to actually stop the council from doing business with certain companies that were guilty of wrongthing. I mean, we don't know whether it would be impossible for them to try to introduce those policies, because they would seem to be go beyond what the law would allow, but they haven't tried to do that so far. So one can only hope that we have been a little bit of a thorn in their side and perhaps stopped that. But difficult to know. So I think some of what we've done now, particularly with the help of our legally qualified members, I don't want to name people by name, just in case I'm not sure how public they want to be on this, but some of our members have tried to look at what's happening at a national level from a principle approach, really, because I think what's particularly concerned us is the way that this process has been run. So the council passed a motion, which it's now admitted was legally non-binding. And off the back of that, it's developed policy. Now, the policy, which perhaps one might expect it to normally go back to full council before it was implemented, hasn't done. It's just been signed off by council staff themselves. And we think that that's because they've been given the political steer from the motion being passed, even though that was not legally binding. So it all becomes a little bit Alice through the looking glass, that there's a lack of democratic accountability, this whole process, that the motion wasn't legally binding. Policy's been made but never actually formally voted on by the council, and this just rolls on. So some of our members have tried to alert bodies like the EHRC and had conversations with them about this process, and also talked to at least one of our MPs about the process as well, to try to encourage them to perhaps particularly with the EHRC to try to put some guidance out about how councils go about this, just manage this process, because it really does seem to be a democratic deficit on this. I think also, given the issue of the clear clash between trans rights and women's rights has got higher up the political agenda, we've had a little bit more success in getting hearings from some councillors and different political parties, and that's allowed us to have more face-to-face conversations, which have been productive because they are aware that there are issues there. And so we hope that they will help steer us through some of the processes in the future, and watch out, because some of these policies, for example, will come up for annual review, and that might be an opportunity for councillors to step back and find that golden bridge that Lou originally talked about as an outcome of the whole process, and step back across it onto the side of women's rights, perhaps.
it sounds as though the fourth estate, the media, have been lacking, because normally if there's any controversy to do with the council, it's front page news, or at least second page 2 news. It's really a hot topic, and usually the papers and local radio are quite happy to have a go or interrogate the councillors. Has any of that happened?
It's been
Very,
fascinating.
very little, hasn't it, Lou? Yeah.
It's
Go
been
on,
interesting.
you talk.
The press release got 0 responses, and then we did it again, national and local, radio, print, online, TV. And some of us had local contacts. We can only assume that they were terrified, because if you look at the political makeup of Bristol and the general leanings of people in Bristol, it is very much a social justice, environmentally aware city. I mean, the Greens are in power, more or less. They're on a par with the Labour Party, but it's fully expected that the Greens will get total overall control. And when you look at the history, Bristol's really shifted, and nobody wants to burn their bridges, never mind build one for Bristol. It's as if we don't exist, which is why we asked Sex Matters to publish our statement. And it's been immensely frustrating.
And I can imagine that going to council and taking the courage to speak in the public participation part of the council meeting, and to have councillors actually turn their back on you.
Actually, leave the chamber. We had one example where they left, came back in, saw on the large screen that another of our members was about to ask a second question, making a second statement, and got back up out of their seat and left the chamber again, and had to wait for another 5 minutes before they came back in. It was really it was both funny, but also really disturbing from a democratic point of view, that councillors who are there to represent their constituents thinks it's acceptable to not even hear our mainstream views being expressed in the council chambers.
There were moments.
Go on.
There were moments outside the council. So mostly we just went inside, but a couple of times we stood outside. And there was one time when I made 30 placards. There was probably about 30 of us turned up, and we put sex realist statements on the placards, and pro-lesbian statements. Oh, I'm getting a bit of an echo. And pro-lesbian statements, and people came round and joined us from other places. So we had a couple of visitors from London, and we handed out flyers and we handed out leaflets. And it went down far better than I would have expected. I was actually surprised at the reception that we had. It was as if, when on a one-to-one basis, the elected members were willing to engage, but collectively, it feels like there's a lot of fear around. And fundamentally, what councillors want is to be elected at the next election.
And when is the next election?
Spring next year.
So it's 2024. So have you got people ready to quiz the candidates when they come round?
Well, we don't want to give too much of our tactics away, Alison.
Of course,
we do have some plans. We are keeping some of them quiet. And I've said next year, but I'm wondering now if I've got mixed up, because that's when the mayor's going. So there's going to be a complete change in the way that the Bristol is governed, because come April 2022, there isn't going to be a mayor 24. Who is executive with his executive members on the cabinet. So I think that will make a difference. I think it's unlikely it will be in our favour in terms of Bad Policy Watch, in terms of sex-based rights. It won't be in our favour. What matters, though, is continuing. And that's very difficult, because maintaining motivation when you think you're not getting very far, you have to grab those small victories when they come and hold on to them. And we do have some councillors that are on side, quietly on side, and that helps.
Yeah. And how will you make sure that the on-sideness of these councillors that's made aware to the voting public?
That's not something that we've considered. It's a good question. We can discuss it amongst our group, because it's important for us to make collective decisions. And we've been into council. We've had a couple of meetings with one supportive councillor in particular, and we've asked him to do what he can from the inside.
Yes, that's useful. Of course, the general tenor of these sorts of motions and the political breakdown of the councillors who are getting involved in this means that often the only people that you can get, in some cases, the only people you can get to support you are people who you wouldn't, let's say, naturally turn to for that sort of support. Is that the sort of thing that you have experienced?
Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, I think we're all finding different allies in this fight. Although there are people from at least 3 political parties that we know are sympathetic to our views. So it's not all one way.
That's really interesting. Now I'm wondering whether, come the next election, a body like, let's say, the WRN, the Women's Rights Network, will hold women's hustings and actually challenge candidates to say what it is they're prepared to do to support women's interests.
That would be really great. The problem for us, I think, is that while we see this issue as really important, which I think it is on its own terms, but also about what it says about politicians' willingness to rely on material reality and basic truth for truth.
Yes.
You know, for some of them, it's quite a niche issue that they're not willing to spend the political capital on, given how some members of their political party, they take the diametrical opposite view to us and are equally convinced of their truth, and therefore, you know, I mean, we all know that this is a very difficult issue for politicians to navigate, and most of them just hope it all goes away. But our group has chosen to make sure that we don't go away, and we keep on sending those emails and turning up.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, doesn't it? But I can't help thinking that if I was, as a citizen, getting the courage up to go and speak, and as I stood up, some of the councillors were not even prepared to listen, so they could say whether your arguments were reasonable or unreasonable. How can they tell if they're not there to listen? It strikes me that those people aren't doing their job.
Well, it depends what you think their job is. I mean, if their job is to stop wrong thinkers being given a platform, they are doing their job. I mean, I think that the reason that they're doing that is not, we have heard that actually we've made them feel unsafe by just being there, just being there. But I think that their main tactic of leaving the chamber is to make our views seem utterly beyond the pale, and therefore to make it harder for ordinary people who've got a lot to lose to go along and ask those questions, because they're so fearful because of the, you know, it creates a chilling effect. If what you're asking leads a councillor to leave the chamber, it must be absolutely terrible. You know, I think that this is a clear tactic on their part to make us seem utterly unreasonable.
And yet, as we know, these beliefs that you hold, and most of us, many of us here tonight, I don't want to speak for everybody, hold, are consistent with mainstream opinion.
Polling. Yeah, that's right.
Polling,
yeah. Which is why, you know, why there's been such a strong tactic of no debate for such a very long time. That's why, isn't it?
I mean, you mentioned, sorry, Alison. You mentioned,
carry on, please.
You mentioned not doing their job. And I think that's a good moment to point out that there is a fundamental flaw in democracy in that elected members do not have job descriptions at any level, be it parish, district, county, unitary, or indeed in our national government. And if there's one thing that I would change, it would be a job description and responsibilities that they need to carry out. They need criteria that they should be meeting. At the moment, all we have that's compelled is the code of conduct. The Nolan principles aren't compelled, they're advisory, and they're suggested and they're recommended and they're held in very high esteem. But councillors don't have a job description, and I think that that's erroneous.
Yes. Of course, it isn't a job, is it? You know, when we are on councils, we don't get pay, we get an allowance for the various duties that we're called on to perform. So it isn't a job. And I think, to be honest, quite rightly so, it's more of a calling. It's not like, well, if you're elected, you can be unelected, or in my case, deselected. And this happens a lot nowadays, that people with the inappropriate opinions can be sidelined. But if they're not prepared to listen, and as you say, no debate was the watchword for a number of years. If they don't debate, if they're not prepared to debate, then their skill at trying to convince people of their cause atrophies, doesn't it?
I hope so.
Well, also you just end up living in your echo chamber. But you know, for some politicians, if their primary concern is to be re-elected, to be selected to be a councillor or to be an MP, then that might be enough. You know, appealing to your core base in your party is enough. And this perhaps they see as a niche issue that isn't animating voters on the doorstep, and so they can afford to go against that. What I think is quite mainstream opinion that we share, because they really just primarily need to get onto the ballot paper, and that depends on appealing to their political party. So
Yeah.
I can see the logic in their position, but it's quite frustrating when I think that some of them don't even believe what they're voting for.
And also there's a limitation in terms of how many questions, statements, motions, interventions that elected members can bring to full council. Oh, is that my alarm going off? That's clever, isn't it? That's my normal Monday night meeting alarm. And so when I've specifically spoken, you know, in a sort of 1 to 3 meeting with an elected member, you know, he's like, well, I'm limited. I have this much space that I can bring forward. So they won't bring forward something that's about sex-based rights, that has a gender critical approach that relates to safeguarding children, because they know it's controversial and they know it's tricky. So what we need are more councillors who are as gutsy as some of our national MPs, who have been willing to speak out and speak up and take that risk, and it has paid off for a number of them.
So I don't want you to reveal your plans, but I can't help thinking that this is a prime example of a council where individuals, maybe independent individuals, stand on a ticket of proper debate. You know, we've got a slogan: Liberals debate. That's what we do because we're Liberals. And I'm sure that that's true of lots of other parties as well. But currently, it seems that in many cases, people who say they're Liberals aren't prepared to do the Liberal thing and entertain opposite views. What do you think the likelihood? What's the likelihood of people coming forward to be independent candidates, let's say, or to try and stand?
We know that 2 of the independent former Lib Dem councillors, now independents, both either did they vote against the motion or they certainly abstained, one or the other. So
Right.
so it does give credence to the idea that independents can be a little bit more independent minded on this issue.
Yeah. Now you said that I'm going to bring in some of the audience shortly, and please do put some more questions and comments in the chat so that I can call on you. I'm going to ask Terry Sayers Cooper to speak later, and also Bev White, but we do need some more comments. But as you say, this isn't the only place where this happened. I know it happened in South Oxfordshire, and it also happened in my council, which is the partner council of South Oxfordshire, Vale of Whitehorse. And we did actually manage to get it watered down before it was presented to the councillors, because the initial draft was ridiculous, in fact. So we managed to stave it off for a number of months and then water it down. And as you say, Patrick Aaron, who is the monitoring officer and the legal expert on both councils, said just what you said, that is aspirational and not necessarily compulsory for. In fact, they simply couldn't put it into practice if it went against their duty in law. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about the public sector equality duty? Quite a lot of us know something about this, but
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure those of you who haven't looked at this deeply have heard of it at least. So the Equality Act says that public authorities like councils have got to comply with the public sector equality duty. So that goes, it sets a responsibility that goes over and above the responsibilities on private sector organisations like companies not to discriminate against people. So public authorities have got to consider how their policies affect people with protected characteristics. Sorry, I'm just reading this out from the Act, and foster good relations between people who share a protected characteristic and those who don't. But as we've said on the equality impact assessment that the council officers carried out on the draft policies, we think that whole process was flawed. I mean, they had a very short consultation, and the equality impact assessment, the template clearly sets out, it provides an opportunity for the officers to consider how that policy affects different people with different protected characteristics. So in this case, it should have looked at how does the trans women are women policy impact on disabled people. For example, if you are disabled and you need a carer of the same sex to carry out intimate care, how does this clash with it? But it didn't do that at all. It just went from the perspective of talking about what impact the policy would have on disabled trans people, and the same on, so when it comes to maternity and pregnancy as a protected characteristic, they looked at what impact their proposed policies had on pregnant trans people. Which we think that they got the whole point of that equality impact assessment wrong, and therefore didn't meet that public sector equality duty at all.
There is a question here, which is, excuse me, which is coming from, let me just turn this on. Kate Super asks, who does the equality impact assessments? Is it the DEI officers?
I don't think it will be. I think if anybody knows better, correct me if I'm wrong, but okay, so Bev says there's no legal requirement to do one at all. And I would think whichever officer is in charge of steering that particular policy through from start to finish will be the one that carries out the equality impact assessment.
I see. So not the councillors then, but officers.
Yes. So this was our particular problem, that the motion had been passed by the council, and then the policy that was going to implement that non-binding motion was written up by council staff and approved by council staff, and it never went back to the full council. And that's what we think is particularly problematic about the way that whole process worked, that there wasn't enough oversight from councillors on it. Although, given the political makeup of the council, they probably would have just passed it through, but it would have given another opportunity for members of the public to go and have their views on record in a full council meeting.
I've got a comment here from somebody who doesn't want to be on screen. The issue for councillors is that they can do stuff to challenge behind the scenes, but once outed in a full council meeting, may find that their ability to do the behind the scenes stuff is hindered as they become easily dismissed as the known transphobe, not to be taken seriously, and not put on committees related to equality or EIAs, equality impact assessments. Yeah.
That's right. That was our experience. Talking to one councillor, we mooted the idea of trying to get the policy in front of a committee in case the committee could call it in. But the councillor said that the potential downside of that would be that even if they could encourage sympathetic councillors to get onto that committee, that their political party could substitute them during the actual meeting and place rather less sympathetic councillors on that committee, and therefore any attempt to scrutinise it would fail.
Astonishing, isn't it? And Alison Wren, do you want to ask or make your comment? Or would you like to make it for you?
Yeah, well, I'm not as good as these two on the emails and so on, but I did go and stand up and ask questions, which caused people to flounce as well. And apparently, no, they're outside weeping because my 1 minute speech about the content of the Science National Curriculum and GCSE biology and A-level biology was so upsetting. I went through it and quoted it because, as you know, I'm a retired biology teacher. And my question was, are you going to make sure that teachers who teach in the national curriculum are protected? Well, of course, they didn't reply. And the other thing that happened when we tried to put in some questions more recently, one of the councillors said we shouldn't even be allowed to ask questions. I can't remember which one it was. We should not be allowed to even ask questions because the questions themselves are so offensive and transphobic.
They said this in public in the council meeting.
No, it was somewhere. I can't remember where they said it. I mean, maybe Louise and Emma can. Can you remember?
No, I think we do hear things third and fourth hand from some of the more sympathetic councillors who are privy to these conversations and have said how upset some of their fellow councillors have been by just our presence at the meetings, making them feel unsafe.
Can I ask Terry to make her comment? You said something about this is what we find on the doorstep. I think that was related to issues that relate to electability.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll put the video on as well. Yeah, I have actually found, even either doing surveys or talking to people, found this a few times, and so have colleagues of mine, that people just say, well, you don't even know what a woman is. Why would we want to talk to you? Why would we want to vote for you? And it's just like, the thing that is really tough is that the Lib Dems have a policy which we have to stick to. So we all have to talk from the same hymn sheet, as it were, when you may not even believe that policy yourself, and it's or have trust and faith in that policy yourself because of other. The whole question started for me when I was talking to a colleague of mine, a work colleague of mine, who is I put it in the chat, who is a dyed in the wool Labour voter, card carrying the whole thing, and she just said to me, at the moment, the only party that is speaking truth to me is the Conservative Party, who obviously she would never, ever vote for. But she said it's left me voiceless, completely politically voiceless, because what's happening in both the Labour Party and any of the other parties is that literally that there are women's rights are being trampled in favour of transgender rights. And it isn't, I think the thing that's really difficult is that we're not anti-transgender. We just don't like women's rights being trampled by the transgender constituency, if you like. And these are the things that are really difficult to answer on the doorstep as well, because you're dividing yourself between what the Lib Dems policy says and what you genuinely believe as well. That's what the problem is.
I think, Terry, that one of the problems is that this is this belief that we have to stick to party policy. And as far as I'm aware, I'm sure colleagues will correct me if I go off piste here, but we don't have to believe, we don't have to agree with every policy. Now, clearly, most of the time, we're going to agree with most of the policies because to us they make sense. But if there's something that you've really got a rooted, principled objection to, we're not expected to swallow that. And in fact, several of the complaints I've had have been decided in my favour on the basis that we don't have to adhere all the time to party policy.
As it should be, really, because we're Lib Dems.
Indeed, and you know, if we're not able to speak and discuss and debate and take a different point of view, what does that say about our ability to countenance the whole of material reality? So don't worry too much about it. Okay. You know, if somebody says this to you on the doorstep, you don't know what a woman is, and people I know have said this even to people like me who knows exactly what a woman is, then you can say to them, actually, that's not true of us all.
Yeah.
Quite a few Liberal councillors and MPs know exactly, and parliamentarians know exactly what's going on, and are trying our best to make things and even party policies better. The trouble is, when we, for instance, submit motions to our conference, we're not allowed to put those at the conference. But there are lots of ways to get things heard, and we're doing our best to do that.
That's why I'm with you here.
Yeah.
Thanks
for your point. That's really great. And they keep telling us that it never comes up on the doorsteps, and you're telling us that it actually does.
Yes, it does. Yeah, for sure it does. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh well, thank you. Keep doing your best, and every little will help. Bev White, I think, has made a comment. I don't know whether you want to say that, Bev, yourself. Hello.
Somebody said about maybe if we keep on persisting, then people will start speaking up, but I'm not sure they will, because I know I've started attending my local parish meetings, so I've started on street activism every month in my town, and I've had a number of councillors approach me and say, we don't want you here, the police, the council, the police and the community don't want you here. And I said, but I am part of the community, I've lived here for 20 years. So I had two councillors come and sit that to me. I've had the CEO of Cambridgeshire City Council and a county councillor sitting in a pub opposite watching, and then accused of hate speech. But they just turn around, you complain and use a code of conduct, and then it's like, oh, maybe I was a bit strong. They back down. So then the monitoring officer then sits there, because I don't know what happens with the complaints process, but nothing, you know, it's nothing's happening. I've just been called hate speech again for raising the issue about women's toilets, and again and I knew damn well that they would sit there and say, well, it wasn't aimed at you, we didn't at the council, it was just there to say that hate speech has been spoken in the council. And you know damn well that they're not going to do anything. I'm going to go to the monitoring officer with it, but they're not going to do anything. And I think it's the same whether it's county, parish, district. They all, you know, I think you've got a cohort of bullies within the council, and the rest of the people around are just stifled from saying anything. And I think they're too cowardly, a lot of them, to break ranks. They've got no backbone at all.
So, some haven't, but quite a few have. And we have a councillors network, which is growing, and there are quite a few Lib Dem councillors who are prepared to speak up. It doesn't make them very popular, but they are prepared to do it. Natalie's got a comment to make. Nat, do you want to make your point? Nat, are you with us? I'll come back to you, shall I? Okay, I'll come back to you later.
Alison, can I just make I don't know how much time we've got, but I'm sensing it's running out. Lou and I talked a little bit about what advice our group would give to anybody else that was facing a council thinking of doing the same thing. Can we just run through a couple of points?
Yes, I wish you would. Good.
Okay, so we thought you needed to find sympathetic councillors but maintain political independence. That's a little bit tricky at the moment, given how there only seems to be, as one of your the people on the Zoom call has said, that there only seems to be one party at the moment that has got a fairly clear view on this. Find out what single-sex facilities there are in your council area and ask questions about what would happen to them. Make it really specific examples. And then find a way of communicating with supporters, because given what we've talked about what a hostile environment the council chamber can be, with some councillors very much against us, you know, we need to accept that not everyone wants to make a question or a statement in there. I certainly haven't done in the full council. And so make sure you've got some sort of way of communicating with your members that allows people who just want to do a little bit of activism with a role. So you ask for volunteers to email their local councillors or to ask a particular question or so on, but just make sure that you're not relying on your core group of committed volunteers, and you've actually got other people who you can give little jobs to. Then to try to involve communities that have got specific protected characteristics, and we've already talked about some of the problems we've experienced with that, with the dilemma that they face with their funding. And we've also noticed that some of the faith communities are a bit reluctant to get involved, perhaps concerns about being tarred with the bigot brush is very difficult for them. But see if you can make inroads there. It's worth doing, even though it can be a little bit difficult. And then my final one was to get information about South Oxfordshire Council's backtracking in front of councillors and council officials before they take any decisions, or afterwards if it needs be, so that they've got a legal bridge to walk back across if they need it. And I think, Lou, have you got anything to add to that? I know that you've talked already about working out your objective at the beginning rather than just launching into your very cross actions that everybody feels at the beginning when they're faced with this kind of motion. Is there anything else?
I think working in groups is a very specific and challenging thing. And when people come together around a collective issue with a collective goal, you can have groups that gel and work, and you can have groups that don't. And you need processes for decision making. Who's going to make the decisions? Is it going to be the whole group? Is it going to be a majority? Does everybody have to agree and have consensus? So being really clear about that helps. And I'd just like to emphasize Emma's point, really, having that wider group of people that you can call on and say, hey, please, can you send this email? Please, can you go and say this in council? What we have is a Google group. So we've got an email list, and there's about 30 people on there, but there's only between 4 and 6 of us that meet regularly on Zoom. But everybody else is kept informed. They know what's going on. They're part of the communication and information networking process. And when they have something to feed in, they can do that via email. They can make digital points. They don't need to necessarily turn up to meetings. And I think it's okay to recognise that people have different amounts of time and different levels of responsibility. And if one person can just send in a web link, send one email. If somebody else can send an email that somebody else has drafted. We did work collaboratively on statements to council. There were times when 2 people could go to council, but only one person had time to write the statements. So be collective, be collaborative, and recognise that your participation levels vary, and it will also change over time. And I think be more creative about tactics.
Yeah, if you can have fun while you're doing it as well. I think the Soul Sisters in Scotland had a really good action where they put pairs of shoes walking away from the Scottish Parliament concourse, and that was very effective, I think. And lots of the campaigns that they've done in there have been notable. Nat said she can't actually speak out loud about this, but it hasn't been the case historically that you're able to disregard or not agree with the policy, which is why she needed to bring her case against the Lib Dem party. Now, it's not only the Lib Dems that have people taking cases against them. There are 3 Green Party lawsuits out. I think Shahra Ali's case comes up for final arguments sometime soon. And Nat says she was targeted by a trans rights activist for challenging party policy on this topic, and she's put her crowd justice case page in the chat if you want to have a look at that. I know she needs support with that. And Toby says, Bev, replying to Bev, parish council often have fewer candidates than vacancies. Indeed, that's the case with lots of parish councils that they frequently co-opt. How about standing for election at parish? Because parish and town is often where a lot of the actual work gets done. I don't suppose that was aimed pointedly at you, Bev, but that was just a reply. Let's see, who else has got we've got a comment here saying we're not sure that it does atrophy. So many appear to use stalls or call hate speech. Nobody can define what hate speech is, and they can, if you complain using code of conduct, and they said didn't mean to say that. And the monitoring officer is very often inclines towards, it seems, supporting councillors. And to be fair, often councillors do get appalling abuse from some members of the public about, I don't mean us, about what we might think would be perfectly reasonable comments they have made. And, you know, that's a real issue for many councillors. But sometimes go on.
The code of conduct, though, is it's very unwieldy. The standards regime is unwieldy. Yes. And at times there's been a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And I think of all the processes that I can imagine being involved in, the standards process is the one that provides the least satisfaction to a complainant. And I think if there is a problem with a particular elected member, that the most efficient route is often to go straight to the group leader, because the group leaders hold that control and that power within the political party. I mean, obviously it's tricky if you have independence, but I think I've consistently found that the way to resolve issues, and especially if somebody's behaved in an offensive manner, is to negotiate with the group leader.
I see. Yes, so that may be a way to get more attention to your complaint by actually speaking to the group leader, and they can perhaps have words with them.
I wouldn't do it after you've put in a complaint, because the group leader won't then be able to engage. No. I think initially it's a more efficient way is to speak to the group leader. But I mean, the first step is to have a telephone call with the monitoring officer, to send an email and ask if you can have a telephone call. So having an off the record conversation with the monitoring officer. And quite often the monitoring officer will then go and speak to the group leader. I just think that I know for a fact, having spent 20 years in local government standards, that the system is rarely fit for purpose.
Yeah, sadly true. Diana, do you want to make your point about the equality impact assessments? Let's see, Diana.
Yeah, I did query this because it kept coming up wrongly, particularly in planning and other documents that we had for scrutiny. I can't remember who I put a complaint to initially, somewhere in the council. Anyway, HR came back to me with a rather patronising explanation of what sex and gender meant. I've got an English degree. I'm perfectly capable of working out, and also O-level human biology. Not that that's a particularly high level, but I've got the basics. And so now it sometimes appears with gender and sex in brackets, and at some reports they've just not changed it at all. Anyway, I brought it up with our deputy leader when I had my one-to-one, and basically was told to drop it. So. But I won't, because I was elected again in May this year, and you know, I'm way past the retirement age, and I'll be retiring next time. So I just feel free to make a nuisance of myself for quite a long time.
You've got nothing to lose. It sounds like
absolutely nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your service for a number of years, and I think people like you are so valuable, because you can make the point and there's nothing they can do to stop you, really, because you know you're very experienced, and if you can mentor some of the younger ones, that's another way that maybe.
Well, usually it's the younger ones are worse. I mean, particularly the university educated ones. You know, they've been totally captured in university. So yeah. Yeah, I do speak to people, and they listen. I mean, some people do take notice, but I do recognise that it is the younger ones in their early 20s who have come out of university who are, you know, they're the most difficult ones, really.
I think it's
I
because
think that it's not just an age thing because they genuinely believe it. I think the social costs for young people to challenge this are just so much higher. I mean, I agree that some of them are sort of steeped in this from university, but I think that, you know, I know in my own experience, and I'm sure it's the same with other people on here, the older you get, the fewer you give, really. And I think that social cost for young people is just the risk of alienating their whole peer group is just too great, isn't it?
Well, I would say that one of our councillors has got a job at the university. I can't remember. She was their diversity person for Students' Union at one point, and she's very pro all the trans stuff. And yeah, I mean, I tried to book for a day's course for something or other at the university, and I was filling in the form, and I couldn't actually complete it without stating what my pronouns are. And you know, I tried a couple of times, and it just kept throwing me back, and you know, I had to fill them in. So eventually I just put N/A, you know, non-applicable, and it actually did accept that as being something. So you know, it's just crazy, really, the whole thing.
Well, that's cursed speech, and that shouldn't be allowed. And in fact, I'm sure that it's whether you're trans or not is a special data, and I think there's some requirement by the Data Protection Act that people shouldn't be asking for those sort of.
No, they shouldn't. And the other thing was, I'm chair of our Communities, Culture and Leisure Scrutiny, and some of the forms that go out from the council, you know, gathering stats, so they have non-binary as an option. Anyway, so there was a chart showing, you know, the responses and sex, male and female and non-binary. Anyway, at our chair's briefing, I brought up the fact that isn't that going to throw the stats out? You know, if people are sort of ticking non-binary, what's the point of having male and female? You know, because we don't know what the non-binary people are. And basically they said it was there not to sort of upset anyone. I thought, for heaven's sake, you know. Anyway, I made it quite clear. I mean, I did say, look, I'm quite happy people can identify as what they like. I said I could identify as Superman, but, you know, I'm not Superman, you know, so how's that going to sort of appear on a form? Anyway.
Yes, a lot of responsible data people, like Professor Alice Sullivan of University College London, are saying this very thing, that having these extra ridiculous, frankly ridiculous categories messes up the stats, messes up the census, and you know, we've already seen that huge numbers of people living in ethnic minority areas like Newham have got more people who say they're trans than places like Brighton.
Well, so they don't understand the forms, and I mean, the same has been pointed out with the erasure of women as a word when you're putting literature out for cervical screening. You know, because the people who don't have English as a first language don't know what we're talking about. You know, so, yeah.
And yet it doesn't happen with things like prostate problems. They talk about men's health there.
Yeah, well, it's men's rights. It's all about men's rights, isn't it? Yeah. Basically.
And somebody said earlier that they don't have to fill in equality impact assessments. No, they don't. And sadly, sometimes even when they do, they make an absolute lash up of it. I went on a workshop with Audrey Ludwig. Those of you who know her as one of the legal feminists, writing excellent blogs about topical cases. She gave a workshop to us before lockdown, in fact, some time ago, And the examples that she had of equality impact assessments were absolutely chronic. And as she said, they don't have to do it. But if you take out a discrimination suit against them, if they had done equality impact assessments properly, it would illustrate that they had some notion and were trying to comply with their public sector equality duty. So, that's one way you can prove that you're doing your best to balance all the different and competing protected characteristics, is by taking a proper considered view about the equality impact. So yeah, it may not be compulsory, but it's meat and drink to a litigation lawyer. I've got a question from Rachel. Rachel, do you want to ask your question, please, about the Scottish court?
Yeah, sorry, taking the conversation a slightly different angle, but one thing that we probably need to do if we can't stop the policies getting in is to find legal avenues to challenge them. And one question is, now we've had the legal judgment in Scotland where they said that a trans woman not in possession of a gender recognition certificate is legally a man. Therefore, a council that says that they are going to act as if a trans woman without a gender recognition certificate is legally a woman puts them at odds with national law, and to an extent which you would say probably exceeded their remit and their power.
Yes, you'd be able to challenge that, won't you?
Well, you would be able to challenge it if you could find a policy lawyer willing to take on a case. And therein lies the rub, because I did reach out to broader networks to see if there was a gender critical policy lawyer who was willing and able to take this forward. I met a brick wall. I didn't find one. Our group weren't 100% sure if we wanted to go in that direction, but it would have been useful if we'd had an individual to ask questions and be able to make an informed decision. And then a GC policy lawyer has recently come to light. However, if we were going to start with a judicial review, we didn't have the time because we were too close to the deadline.
Right.
And the other issue is that we've spent a lot of money collectively on different legal cases. And I wasn't sure personally, I can't speak for the group, but I wasn't sure personally if we were to put out a legal crowdfunder, how many people would want to support something that was in a council, because the council, what's happening in councils doesn't seem to be that attractive. And there's something else actually that Emma and I mentioned when we were doing our preparation for this, which is that one of the, before Maya Forstatter's worry ads, Worthy of Respect in a Democratic Society case, there was a previous result, a previous judgment, and that came out on the 6th of July, and that gave us a lift. So
I think that was slightly the other way around, wasn't it? I think it's confusing all those cases, but I think she won the Worriads ruling, and then the 6th of July one, the day after that was the when she actually, it was proved that she was discriminated against on a fact basis on in her particular situation. So yes, that gave us a bit of a lift as well, doesn't it? But I completely agree with Lou. You know, we've had discussions about legal action, but it's the marketplace for crowdfunders for GC actions is really crowded at the moment, isn't it? And I think that local government is just not a sexy headline grabbing topic. We've already, as we've talked about, struggled to get media coverage of any of these issues. It's niche, and you know, what goes on in council chambers is very difficult to get local media to cover that anyway, in the same way that they did in the 70s and 80s. That money for local media just isn't there anymore to send a reporter to cover all of those, what is going on, and ask those questions and hold local government to account.
It might be possible, though, I suppose, to try and use that to sway the council's own legal team.
I think you're completely right. I was thinking, I mean, I don't know what they would have done if that Scottish decision had come out in the midst of all of this process, whether that would have held some sway and we could have used that at all. It is interesting to think how people might use that now. It's got pluses and minuses, hasn't it, that ruling, that you know, that people without a GRC are still legally the sex that they were born.
According to Michael Foran, I don't know if you follow him on Twitter, Twix. Michael Foran's a very reputable lawyer who's actually had some dispute with one of our Lib Dem LBGP plus members who purports to be a lawyer but isn't, about this operation of this finding, and he says that it is something that would be able to be pursued if people purport that they are trans-identified males trying to access female single-sex spaces, then they can be stopped. And it sounds as though from now on you would need to have your GRC, your gender recognition certificate, ready for if anybody was to ask you, that you should be able to ask them to furnish you with some proof that they are.
That's right, because he's been very clear that the idea that you can't ask for a GRC is not correct, that actually service providers are able to ask for a GRC, sorry. Yeah, it would. And I think that comes back to what Lou and I were saying before about the importance of doing a analysis of what single-sex services are available within your council area, so that you can then go and speak to either the specific service providers or raise it at council, like what does this actually mean, and will you be able to ask for a GRC, and really put those practical examples in of how it will affect service users on the ground.
One of the members of our broader network has said that it would be interesting to ask the same question to different areas. So if your council had responsibility for leisure services and they were running single-sex swimming, then you can contact the member responsible for leisure, who will probably contact the officer responsible for leisure and ask them. You can also ask different members of staff at the leisure centre at reception, and you could ask your local councillor as well. And it would be interesting to find out if there was a difference. There's something quite an anecdote that I have come across, and actually it was told to me by an elected member. And she said, if my mum, who is in her 80s, goes into the changing room in Cabot Circus in Bristol, and she goes to a department store, perhaps a well-known store like Marks and Spencer's, and she goes in to get changed, and she realizes that there is a full-bodied man next to her in the adjacent cubicle, who is indeed going out into the area where the mirrors are, who may or may not be partially clothed. And the other person involved in this scenario potentially will likely be a young woman. There may be a teenager who's at the desk. And she looked me in the eyes and she said, who holds the power? My 80-year-old mum, the teenage woman on reception, or the male in the changing room adjacent?
Yeah.
And these imbalances of power rarely get discussed. These statements are glib. They're just thrown off the cuff. Trans women are men. Trans women are men. You see, I can't even say it the other way around, the way the activists say it, because it just seems not to make any sense at all. But there's a gross power imbalance occurring, and I don't think that is recognised by people who propagate this narrative.
We've got a question or a point really from Florence Waller. Florence, I'd like you to make your point, please, which is a very good one. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, I can do. So, can you hear me? Sorry. My question is probably worth inquiring as to what the same-sex care policies are of care providers that are funded by their local councils, because most care providers do receive council funding, whether that's in domiciliary care or home care setting.
Go on, tell us more.
Well, all of the care providers are supposed to be able to offer same-sex care as per CQC regulation 10,
Care
which is
Quality Commission.
dignity which is dignity and respect, and that's sex as covered by the Equality Act. It's also an issue of consent, which is regulation 11, because if women don't consent to a male providing their care, then that's a criminal matter. So it's really important that local councils actually understand that that's a criminal matter that they should be dealing with.
It's an assault, isn't it?
If it's intimate care, it's sexual assault. If a man should touch a woman against her consent, yes.
Do you want to tell us something? I know your name. Would you want to tell us a little bit about this new organisation you've set up?
Yeah, sure. It's called caringaboutdignity.org. The idea is that carers like myself, or people who are dependent on care, or the family advocates, can share their stories to our website, which we can then anonymize and share those stories. The idea behind that is that next time anyone should say, oh well, this never really ever happens, you can then direct them to the website and show them a body of data that says it does. So that's what the website's about, with the hope that councillors or people in government can see that information and see what a widespread issue this is.
Yeah.
So
It's a really widespread issue, and one which has been brought into stark relief by Henrietta. I don't know if anybody knows of her. She tweets about her need for single-sex, same-sex intimate care. And Dr. M, you can find Dr. M, who's quite an authority on all these issues, who's had brain injury and consequently requires single-sex care from time to time. And it's a real big issue because some providers won't guarantee same-sex care if requested. And
I would say it's most providers that the issue in care is so serious. It's so understrained with chronic understaffing. It's underfunded, yet many providers make over £100 million in profit and pay their bigwigs. But it's the majority of providers, so it's not just some. So if you know anybody who's depending on home care services, you better let them know that it's not just a rare instance, or they might have said, oh, I request female only care, but the care providers will come up with an excuse about being understaffed, and a lot of people won't complain because they're over a barrel because they need care, but they're very frightened of their care being rescinded. Henrietta actually talks about that in some of her Twitter threads as well, but that's not uncommon. So there's going to be a lot of people, hopefully, who may find our website actually.
Can you put it in the chat, please? Because people heard it, but it would help them.
Yeah, I will. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of people who won't actually be complaining to the care providers for fear that they'll have their care rescinded. So the issue as we know it, we've just, to use a crude analogy, we're just sort of lifting the scab at the moment. There's a lot more, it's far more widespread than we could even imagine, I should say.
Yeah, if my mum needed intimate care, sadly she's no longer with us, but it would be essential for her to have same-sex care. I think it would be undignified and unbecoming for elderly people, men or women. Sometimes men want only male carers, and I understand that. Obviously, sometimes they know that they think that they'll get better care from women, but that's a debate. Caringaboutdignity.org,
yeah. It's important to note there that nobody has to justify their reasons why they prefer a carer of a specified sex. So that's important. No one has to explain themselves, and you're right. Men can request a same-sex carer or a female carer. That is their right.
And as Terry says, sometimes this could be somebody who, for cultural reasons, can't be in a room only with men. Let alone men with no clothes on.
And that's covered in the Equality Act too. It's important to note also that gender is not covered in the Equality Act unless it's in terms of a gender reassignment. However, if you look on any care providers' websites, you will find the vast majority have left off the word sex altogether on their guidance, because within the guidance of CQC Regulation 10, the guidance says that all reasonable effort must be made to accommodate requests of for carers of a specified sex/gender, or gender/sex. I can't remember. I've got it the wrong way around. But in any case, what I'm saying is that most of these providers miss off the word sex altogether, which is the only word that actually means anything as pertains to the Equality Act.
Yes, indeed, it's a protected characteristic, and gender is not a protected characteristic, although gender reassignment is, and there is a distinction there, which too many people try and blur. Earlier on, Terry was saying that that it's difficult to know what's the, it's easy to get confused. I'm trying to find your comment, Terry. I get very confused with terminology. Anybody else, or is it just me? And of course, it's part of the Orwellian trial to remove language, so we can't complain. If we don't have the language, we can't make the point.
Yes, I think we're very much in a Tower of Babel situation here. However, I do feel that the issue of care, because of person-centered care, and how that the CQC directs that it should be person-centered, so that's the individual requiring the care. The care needs to be structured around their needs. I think it's a really useful area for people who are a bit nervous about the gender issue to be able to tackle these questions, because actually when I was tweeting under the caring about dignity account, I did have a trans identified account ask about what about treating trans people with dignity and respect. This is not verbatim. So I just replied that all people have the right to specify the sex of their carer. And ultimately, this person agreed that this was a rare situation in which the biological sex is important, because they recognise that we're actually also advocating for their own rights to request a carer of a specified sex. So that's quite interesting.
Yes, and at the same time, that carer of a particular sex should not be required, like police officers, prison officers, security officers, should not be required to carry out intimate searches on people of the opposite sex who may present as the same gender. It's you have to be clear about language. We try always to be clear so that people know what's going on. And half of the trouble is that a lot of ordinary people, like us all, we're all ordinary people, don't know at first blush what it means when they read a trans woman. They think that that's a trans-identifying woman rather than a trans-identifying man. If we're clear, I usually say, it's a bit of a mouthful, but once you get you're used to it, it's straightforward. A male with the additional protected characteristic of gender reassignment. So their sex is always male, but they also have an additional protected characteristic of gender reassignment if they have started or are in the process or completed the process of changing their gender, but their sex remains the same. Okay, let's see if anybody. Oh, Terry says you work for an organisation supporting unpaid carers, and I think that's really important to do with people from diverse cultures, isn't it? Do you want to say something about that, Terry? I think we're going to have to start thinking about drawing to a close, but would you care to share with us something of your?
Sure,
your
it's
work?
So I've been working as the diversity inclusion worker for just over a year now. I've spent a lot of time working with people from diverse cultures for the last 30 years, indeed. So I know some of the issues that exist around, for example, women not being allowed to be in a room with men without there being other women, or even, you know, somebody else to
chaperone.
Absolutely, to having chaperones there. And I know that I've spoken to carers. These are unpaid carers. These are people who look after their neighbours, their loved ones, whoever that may be, who've specifically requested that it's only a female carer that comes to exactly that thing, to work with their mum. And it's both on an age, but also from a cultural point of view. That person cannot have somebody who is a male doing their personal care. It's just not appropriate. On so many levels, that's just not appropriate. And it's a minefield out there to get it right.
So I think we'll be talking about a woman with the additional protected characteristic of age and the additional protected characteristic of religion or ethnic minority status, cultural background. Those are additional protected characteristics which ought to be weighed in the balance for the convenience or the wishes of a carer, let's say, who might want to be able to treat somebody of the same gender but not the same sex. And I think if we're clear about what we're saying, if we speak the truth, that can't be transphobic. That's simply speaking the truth. Absolutely. And then you know exactly what you're talking about. And ordinary people who haven't come across this can have an inkling of what we're talking about. Thanks for that, Mary.
Welcome.
Florence says language is important. It's crucial, I think, because that's all that we have if we're trying to get over to people. Language and body language, really. Let's see if there's any more comments that we have to say. Somebody's been calling into KJK recently. Was that Florence, I think, on Let Women Speak YouTube. Natalie says local councillors won't be adequately trained on the Equality Act, though, and won't be well trained enough to challenge their own party policies or the councils. Now, we're going to be running some training for local Liberal Dem councillors, and our next event is going to be on the 8th of December, and I know some people here will be present at that. I'm looking forward to that, and I hope that we'll be able to quote some of the things that Louise and Emma have been saying as part of that awareness raising. And I think this is just, obviously it would take longer than a short course, a short event to get over all the issues and all the legal complexities. But I think what we're trying to do is to give an awareness to councillors, some of them new councillors, some of them long experienced, that things are not necessarily as they're made out to be by people with certain axe to grind. So as I say, I'm looking forward to that on the 8th of December. Has anybody else got any more comments? Because I know we've taken a lot of your time this evening, Emma and Louise. Has anybody got any more comments? Then I'll take a last query or question.
I'd like to say something else. There's something to be said for one-page councillor briefing documents in response to the previous question about lack of training. And sometimes councillor briefing documents can be 2 sides of A4, but writing a really simple, really clear briefing document, which in itself offers links to further information should they wish to explore, has a lot of value.
Yeah, that's true. If you can boil it down to 1 page, that would be a miracle, and you deserve to be blogging for Legal Feminist along with Naomi Cunningham. But yeah, it's an aim devoutly to be wished. Terry said something. How do we throw off the accusation of being transphobic or using hate speech? I think that the people can tell truthfully when you're using hate speech or you're just speaking factually, and you have to you do have to develop quite a thick skin and a rhinoceros hide, actually, because if you speak the truth, that cannot be transphobic. And our party has had to take back their former definition of transphobia, which was inconsistent, I think, with the Act and with the Equality Act, and certainly would tend to harm or diminish many women who might have particular points of view about this. They've instituted another one which is a little less draconian, but still I think that it would be possibly open to challenge. So don't let the bullies, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I will not let the bullies try and stop me, because if you do that, then everything's lost. It's easy for me. I'm retired. I don't have to answer to anybody, and you know, from that point of view, I'm the sort of person who can get away with it, if you like. It's not so easy, as somebody said earlier, I think Diana. Young people, mid-career academics, young people in their first job, they're in very fragile circumstances, and I think I agree with them that it's really hard for them to challenge some of these things. But they can use the human resources policies, they can use the Equality Act to support them, and once you say something that's covered by the Equality Act, you know, if you write a letter about your position under the Equality Act, that in itself is a protected act, and any harassment of you because of that would be victimization. A lot of people don't know that, but you know, that is a bit of a sword and a shield, that we do have some protection on that score. Has anybody else got any more questions? Because if not, then I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Emma and Louise for a splendid evening, a really good discussion. Thank you everybody for your contribution as well.